leave a radio on. That's the weirdest thing. Seems to be coming from in here. Ooh. Yeah, it's in here all right. Seems to be coming from this old box of 3006. Whoa! All right. The old 3006. Doesn't get any better than that. Welcome back. You know, if I opened up a box of 3006 and found a stick of double bubble gum or a Fleer baseball playing card, it wouldn't surprise me in the least. It wouldn't even surprise me if I found a Cracker Jacks toy inside the box. That's how American it is. It just doesn't get any more American than the 3006 Springfield. I think everybody has a basic understanding of where the 3006 Springfield comes from. It's embodied in its very name. 30 caliber 1906 rifle was originally its cartridge designation by the military. The U.S. military had quite a fickle number of loadings for it over the years. Its very first loading was actually a 220 grain bullet in its original 1903 designation, which when it was changed, that was a round nose bullet with very poor external ballistics. When it was decided to incorporate a 150 grain Spitzer spire pointed bullet into the round, it required a rebarreling of all the existing 1903 Springfields, which were at the time in existence. And they not only rebarreled them to rechamber them, but also to change the rifling to a slower rifling that would accommodate the lighter bullet. The 3006 was used in war, in one war after another until after Korea, and actually for minor conflicts throughout the world. But you know, naturally, it was the most celebrated U.S. cartridge during the World War I and World War II and Korea. It was used in primarily 3 different combat rifles by the United States. It was used first in the 1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle, which saw service actually right up until very recently. Even the U.S. Marines still use it in certain service matches. Curiously, the one rifle that it was used in that very few people really know about or speak about is the 1917 Enfield, which was a British design rifle that was the primary service issue rifle for the United States troops during the U.S. Expeditionary Forces in World War I. Used the 1917 Enfield probably almost exclusively. There were very few 1903 Springfields actually used at that time. Sergeant York was said to have carried a 1917 Enfield, and historically that would have been the correct gun for him to carry. In fact, in his diary he states that he used also his 45 caliber automatic when he took the German prisoners. That was so famously written about. And in the movie with Gary Cooper, though, he's shown to be using a 1903 Springfield and a Luger pistol, which is historically a little bit different than what really occurred. But the round became very, very much used during World War II. It was the principal battle weapon for U.S. troops during World War II. Supplemented by the 30 U.S. carbine, which was an entirely different round. The bore diameter was its only similarity. It had a 110 grain round nose bullet, semi-round nose bullet, and it was pathetically underpowered for combat use. It was used primarily for support troops, people who had to have carried a gun more as a backup weapon than a primary battle weapon. But the U.S. Garand, the Garand was the automatic weapon that was used during World War II. That was the primary combat arm of the soldier throughout that combat, and also went throughout Korea. So its popularity soared in following those different eras, and by the time post-World War I era came along, it was already seeing considerable civilian use that no other cartridge in American history up until that time could offer. It offered long range, power really to handle virtually anything. It could handle, with a 200 grain bullet, lumbering at 2,500 feet per second, was very good medicine on the largest bears in America. And it could fire 110 grain bullets, which were suitable for varmints. Whether you need a ton and a half of energy on a woodchuck is arguable, but it had the size bullet that was frangible, so that it would at least break up in the back pasture at somebody's farm rather than sailing across the countryside. But it had it all. It had both ends of the spectrum covered. It had velocity that was just simply not heard of in its bore diameter up until that time. It was carrying a 150 grain bullet at over 2,900 feet per second. So this was a cartridge that surely had pretty much everything that the American hunter wanted, and he could say that he had a gun for everything, a gun for all seasons. It's probably, and I would say not probably, it is certainly overbore for virtually 90% of its use in this country. It's certainly far more potent than any white-tailed deer requires. It's certainly far more potent than any varmint needs. It's certainly more potent than the average shooter needs on his shoulder. But because it remains very popular, because it has such a history of versatility throughout that range of big and small, that it's never going to go away. And it also served as the very ideal platform for the development of other historically renowned cartridges. Most notably, the 270 Winchester was simply a cartridge neck down way back in the 20s to accept a 277 diameter bullet, which was a very weird bore diameter, but which gave a 130 grain bullet with much greater sectional density and much better ballistic coefficient than a 150 grain 30-06 bullet. And because of its additional ballistic coefficient, flew a much greater range and a flatter trajectory. Plus, it increased by dropping the weight from 150 grain to 130 grain. It naturally increased the velocity by about 200 feet per second in its first factory loadings. So here's a cartridge that was not only a good cartridge in its own right, the 30-06, but it formed the ideal basis for so many different wildcats through the years. Virtually every bore diameter was wildcatted with a 30-06 case, even down to the 22 caliber. But the 25-06 remains today one of the most enduring wildcat turned commercial cartridges ever made. That was one of the oldest wildcats for many years, and that was based on a 30-06 simply neck down to 25 caliber. And then naturally I spoke about the 270, and then the 280 Remington, The 280 Remington is simply a 7mm bore diameter for the 30-06. It's probably, it's categorically, I would think, probably the very best ballistically of the whole family of 30-06 different chamberings based on the 30-06 case. It's a bore diameter being 7mm, which is sufficient for the very largest game, and it's also got an extremely good, strong ballistic coefficient and sectional density that serves it well throughout its use. And curiously, ironically, the 280 Remington, and for a time known as the 7mm Remington Express, really, it just never caught fire in this country because people compared it. They compared it unfairly to the 270, which was something that it had nothing to do with. The bullet selection, I think, by Remington was the downfall. They picked a 150 grain bullet to go in the 280, which if they were to find a bullet to compare with the 270, it should have been the 140 grain bullet. That would have given it the same, if not better, ballistics and flatter trajectory with a heavier bullet. But sometimes boardroom members, I don't think, are necessarily the sharpest and brightest when it comes to marketing this stuff. They just chamber stuff that sounds good, and they follow sometimes the dictates of the gun writers, and they're not the sharpest knives in the drawer sometimes either. But the 30-06 Springfield is a fantastic development that will be with us forever. Let me just talk a little bit about the usefulness of the 30-06. It's very often compared to its smaller sibling, the 308. The 308 generally comes barreled with a 1 in 12 twist. That 1 in 12 twist enables it to be much more accurate with lighter weight bullets below the 150 grain bullet, and the 1 in 10 twist that's typically used in a 30-06 Springfield enables it to stabilize the heavier bullets up to 220 grains. And that's logical too. The developers of the 30-06 wanted to have the capability to fire bullets upwards of 220 grains, and it could certainly stabilize those bullets with the 1 in 10 twist very easily, which it always does, which gives it very, very strong legs when you start going after a game that requires much heavier bullet and longer bullet construction. The 308 just simply runs out of gas when it gets past 180 grain bullet. Although there are loadings with 190 grain bullets, and sometimes people have put in 200 grain bullets, it's really not well suited for those bullet weights simply because of the length of the cartridge burning chamber. I'll give you an example here. Here's the difference between the two. This one here is actually a 7mm 08, but you can actually see this. You're talking a ½ inch difference in cartridge case length. The difference in powder capacity is 20% greater. It's a 10 grain increase in powder charge over the 308. That difference amounts to only a 10% gain in velocity in the standard bullet weights. When I say standard bullet weights, those bullet weights that range from 125 to 165, even 180 grains. The difference is only about 200 feet per second, which is not, 200 feet per second in ballistics is not as much as most people think it is. A lot of cartridges, a lot of sales have been made on the premise that 200 feet per second knocks down the other guy, but it's not a significant amount in terms of actual downrange performance. The big gain where the 30-06 comes into its own is where the longer case capacity allows, and the quicker rifling twist allows the use of heavier bullets with much greater effectiveness and much greater efficiency, and that efficiency calculates to accuracy too, bullet stability. So it wouldn't be logical to try to stuff a 200 or 220 grain bullet into a short 308 case. It's just simply not going to have enough powder capacity to fit it in there and get the powder in to boot. So you know, when you have a 30-06, it's capable of driving a 220 grain bullet at about the same speed that a 308 drives a 180 grain bullet. Now that is quite an achievement. So that's where the 30-06 comes into its own. How much that is needed by the average person who owns the 30-06 is probably not as big a deal as a lot of people make it out to be. No deer notices the difference between getting hit with a 30-06 versus a 308 when the bullet is 150 or 165 grain bullet. It makes no difference whatsoever. The additional trajectory that's available with a 30-06 might certainly make a difference out in the prairie, but the 30-06 was never really promoted to be a prairie cartridge, though it certainly can do very well with it. There's no reason why anybody with a 30-06 should feel ashamed to take 150 grain bullets or even 125 or 130 grain bullets and go out shooting pronghorns with it at extended ranges. And with 150 grain bullets is certainly more than adequate for mule deer. So at distant ranges, it's not a 270. It shouldn't be compared to the 270, but it certainly can do the job for anybody who wants to have a cartridge that covers all bases. And you know, that's where the 30-06 always shined. It was always the mice to moose cartridge. You know, the guy who has the 30-06 is equipped for anything he wants to go hunting in North America, including the big bears. It wouldn't necessarily be well advised by experienced guides to go after the big dangerous bears, but for those people who are careful and a good woodsman, there's been countless big bruins taken by 200 grain and 220 grain bullets. They break down bone, and that's what's necessary. Heavy bullet construction is the big deal with any cartridge that's going after that stuff. But it's a fabulous cartridge. It's American all the way. It always will be, and it's always going to be around. I think that everybody who knows about rifles should know about the 30-06 Springfield, just because it's the cartridge upon which most other cartridges in this country have been built. But when you're talking about America, you're talking about the 30-06 Springfield. There's nothing like it, and there never will be. Thanks for watching, and God bless.